For our presentation, Gabby and I have chosen to research Frederick Douglass. One of his famous quotes is, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress," and below are two pictures of Douglass. The following information includes background info on Frederick Douglass. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, formerly known as Frederick Douglass, was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland, around 1818. Although Douglass's exact birth date is unknown, he chooses to celebrate it on February 14, 1818, and he lived with his grandmother, Betty Bailey. At the age of 10, his mother died, and when he was young, he was selected to live in his plantation owner's home, which in fact may have been his biological father's. After a few years, Douglass was eventually sent to Hugh Wald's home in Baltimore, Maryland, which was just over 70 miles from where he was born. While he was there, he acquired the skills that contributed to his nationwide fame. Fighting against a ban on teaching slaves literature, Hugh Wald's wife Sophia taught Douglass the alphabet when he was around 12 years old. Douglass started to learn from white children in the neighborhood when Hugh Wald banned his wife's lessons. After these lessons, Douglass began reading newspapers and other political writings, and it was through this that his opposition to slavery began. He then used what he learned from these readings to teach about 40 other slaves his view on human rights and how to read the New Testament. Later, Douglass thanked the Columbian Order for defying his views on civil and human rights. When Douglass turned 20, he married Anna Murray, who helped him escape slavery, and later who he fell in love with. They eventually got married and lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts. In this town, there was a thriving free black community. Douglass joined a church and went to abolitionist meetings and was eventually asked to tell his story at one of the meetings. William Lloyd Garrison was moved by his speech and published a story about him in The Liberator. Douglass then wrote his first autobiography in 1845 called The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Douglass ended up publishing 3 different versions of his autobiography that was expanded on and edited every time. In 1855, he published My Bondage and My Freedom. He then published Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881. Douglass had moved to Ireland so that he would not get recaptured. He lived there for 2 years until they had enough money to buy his legal freedom and then moved back to America. He eventually became a women's rights supporter. By the Civil War time, Douglass was one of the most famous black men. Douglass talked to Abraham Lincoln about the treatment of black soldiers in 1863, and on January 1st of 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom for all black slaves. Eventually, slavery in the United States became outlawed. After the war, Douglass was appointed by many political positions. He became the first African American to be nominated for the Vice President of the United States. Frederick and Anna Douglass ended up having 5 kids named Rosetta, Lewis Henry, Frederick Jr., Charles Redmond, and Annie. Annie died when she was just 10 years old. After Anna's death, Douglass remarried a woman who was a white feminist. Their marriage caused a lot of controversy since she was white and 20 years younger than him. His children did not like that he married her. They remained married until he died 11 years later on February 20th, 1895. He died from a heart attack and was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. Some of Douglass's recognitions are as follows. The Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge, sometimes referred to as the South Capitol Street Bridge, just south of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., was built in 1950 and named in Douglass's honor. In 1965, the U.S. Postal Service honored Douglass with a stamp in the Prominent American series. In 1999, Yale University established the Frederick Douglass Book Prize for works in the history of slavery and abolition in his honor. The annual $25,000 prize is administered by the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale. Also in 2010, the New York Writers Hall of Fame inducted Douglass in its inaugural class. On June 12, 2011, Talbot County, Maryland honored Douglass by installing a 7-foot bronze statue of Douglass on the lawn of the Country Courthouse in Easton, Maryland. We chose Frederick Douglass not only because of his best-selling books, but because of his contribution to American history. After the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, Douglass continued to work for equality for African Americans and women. Douglass began speaking and emphasized the importance of work, voting rights, and actual exercise of suffrage.
The following things are what Douglass had an impact on. Douglass was most famous for his influence on the Civil War. Frederick Douglass was a strong supporter of African American service in the war. He argued that since the war was being fought to end slavery, African Americans should be allowed to fight for their freedom and for that of all of their people. The nation was slow to accept the thinking of Douglass and his co-fighters. However, African American men were seen to be needed for the war effort, and they proved to be extremely important. His most significant legacy was his impact on the fight for freedom and rights for African Americans. Douglass affected this movement by using his eloquence and writing skills. He influenced Abraham Lincoln to create the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolished slavery. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of bloody civil war. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free.
This excerpt is from Chapter 8 of The Narrative of Frederick Douglass. When Douglass is roughly 10 or 11, his old master, Captain Anthony, dies. Douglass is summoned back to the plantation he was born on so that Anthony's children could divide up his property. At the evaluation, slaves young and old are ranked alongside livestock. The humiliation of being inspected like an animal makes Douglass further detest the way slavery corrupts both slave and master. After being inspected, the slaves are to be divided among Anthony's heirs. Their futures will be determined by this moment, over which they have no control, and they may be separated from their friends and family. The slaves fear being taken by Anthony's son Andrew, who is a cruel drunkard. Because Douglass knows what it is like to be treated kindly, the evaluation makes him even more anxious than his fellow slaves. Fortunately, he is not passed to Andrew as he feared. He thanks Providence that he is assigned to Mrs. Auld. He will be sent back to Baltimore to live with Master Hugh and his family. Douglass returns to Baltimore after a psychologically taxing month on the plantation. When Douglass is writing, his style is usually straightforward. He makes sure that the viewer understands him. Therefore, he doesn't write long or complicated sentences, and he tries to speak informally. However, he does sometimes use kind of an enriched language, and parts of his passages can sometimes be difficult to read. 3 literary elements that Douglass uses are setting, conflicts, and point of view. The setting to this piece is very important because it determines his future. Because this passage is based on where Douglass will live, the setting is crucial. The conflict in this passage is man versus man. I chose this conflict because once Douglass gets a new plantation owner, he will constantly have to decide whether or not to take the abuse that a slave endures or if he wants to speak up and stand out against slavery. Point of view is a main factor in this book. Because it is an autobiography that is written, everything that is written comes exactly from Douglass's memories and experiences. A main theme in this biography is slavery. Douglass sees slavery as something that is completely wrong and is not afraid to stick up against it. In the book, Douglass does his best to share his experiences with the reader and to teach about the dangers and inequalities of slavery. The literal meaning of this passage is that Frederick is worried about his future as a slave and where he will live and with what owner. The philosophical meaning is that you should not be afraid to stand out against what you believe in and to support your beliefs.
This excerpt is from Chapter 1 of The Narrative of Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born in Tuckahoe, Maryland. Like most slaves, he does not know when he was born because masters usually try to keep their slaves from knowing their own ages. Douglass's mother is named Harriet Bailey, and his father is an unknown white man rumored to be Douglass's own master. When Douglass was only an infant, he was separated from his mother, as is commonly done to destroy the bond enslaved children feel towards their mothers. Douglass was only able to see his mother 4 or 5 times when she journeyed over from her plantation to his and spent the night with him. When Douglass is only about 7 years old, his mother dies, and he reacted to the tidings of her death with much the same emotions he should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. Because of his separation from his mother and her untimely death, Douglass has no idea who his father is. Ultimately, this fact makes little difference since slaveholders have prescribed that children of mixed parentage always follow the status of their mothers. This allows slave owners to take advantage of their female slaves sexually without reducing their workforce. The mixed-race mulatto offspring are frequently abused because the slave owner's white family resents their existence. To avoid these tensions, a master will often sell his own children to a trader. Douglass's style is very straightforward when he writes. He wants the reader to understand him in his book, so he tries to keep his sentences very short and simple, although sometimes he can use enhanced language. 3 literary elements in this excerpt are characterization, flashback, and setting. This excerpt has characterization because it is describing him and what his child life was like and how he grew up.
There's a flashback that occurs when he talks about his life as a child and when his mom died. He also talks about his father that he did not know in the flashback and who he thinks his father is. The setting in this excerpt is where he was born in Tuckahoe, Maryland. It describes where he also grew up. The literal meaning is that he's describing his life and his future and all of the experiences he went through throughout his life. The philosophical meaning is that the idea of slavery is a very, very bad thing, and it can easily tear apart families.
This is our works cited page. Thank you for listening.